Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this evening's presentation of Great Decisions 2022. Thank you very much for coming. Before I turn the presentation over to Dr. McCoy, just a couple of housekeeping things. Just wanted to remind everyone who our fantastic sponsors are. We have amazing sponsors for this lecture series. We present all 8 lecture topics. Without them, we definitely would not be able to bring such great speakers in to address you on these amazing topics that aren't always easy to digest, but we have people that can actually bring you information and give you context to what is going on. And knowledge is always power, so it's better to have this than to just wonder and worry, I find anyhow. So our series sponsors are the League of Women Voters of Manitowoc County, Manitowoc Public Library Foundation, the Manitowoc Public Library, Lakeshore Unitarian Universalist Fellowship, and Lakeshore Pax Christi. So a huge thank you to all our sponsors. I also did want to remind you that as much as we love our sponsors, we would love one day to be completely self-sustaining. So if you feel that you would like to donate to the Great Decisions Lecture Series, please head to this URL, www.manitowoclibrary.org/events/Great Decisions. There, you will be able to find this brochure, which is a PDF, which is downloadable. It also gives you all the information you could need to know to donate to the Great Decisions Legacy Fund. So take a look at that if you enjoy this programming. I don't want to sound too overly PBS during Pledge Week. However, it would be wonderful if one day we could just do this without having to call upon our sponsors to help us out. Though we do love our sponsors. Make no mistake about that. Secondly, I would like to bring up the fact that we have the Great Decisions companion publication, which is available for this year on all 8 topics, plus a bonus topic about the future of industrialization. This is available at Manitowoc Public Library at the main service desk for $15, cash or check only. It is a fantastic resource. It gives you a lot of background information and a lot of resources that you can look at in addition to what we'll be covering this evening or any of the evenings in our lectures. Also, as you are following along on either Facebook or YouTube, should you have any questions for Dr. McCoy for after her presentation on the subject of Myanmar and ASEAN, please just type them into the comment section and we will get to them. I will read them to Dr. McCoy afterwards and hopefully have a great discussion on the topic. So without further ado, let me present our speaker this evening. Dr. Mary McCoy is a member. One second, I'm going to take the focus off of me. There we go. Dr. Mary McCoy is a member of the teaching faculty at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and the director of outreach for the Center for Southeast Asian Studies. She specializes in democratization, demagoguery, extremist speech, and dictatorship, and is the author of the monograph published by Cornell University Press, Scandal and Democracy, Media, Politics in Indonesia, which examines the role of the press in Indonesia's recent transition from authoritarianism to democracy. So as of right now, I would like to turn the evening over to Dr. McCoy. I'm going to take myself out of the picture. I also wanted to mention that during the PowerPoint, there are some pictures of a graphic nature, but they're absolutely vital that they be included in this, and that people see exactly what is going on. So, Dr. McCoy, I'm going to take myself out of the picture and turn it over to you, and I will get your PowerPoint going right now. So, Dr. McCoy.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you all for the honor of this invitation to give a talk for the Great Decisions series, which I'm a big fan of. And thanks very much to Kathy Fishbeck for inviting me, and to Tim Gadzinski for the warm introduction, and to all of you for joining me tonight. I'll begin by noting something up front, which is that although the name of my talk following the Great Decisions lecture title is Myanmar and ASEAN, I'll be using the name Burma rather than Myanmar in the talk itself. And just to explain, the SLORC military junta, whom I'll discuss shortly, were the ones who renamed the country Myanmar in 1989, which is not a controversial word necessarily, but it was a controversial initiative that this was part of, called the Adaptation of Expression Law, which sounds very Orwellian, and indeed was very Orwellian. The US, though, still uses Burma. It's used it for many years to show solidarity with the pro-democracy forces. And probably most importantly, I have two Burmese graduate students, and they have asked me to use Burma because that's the name that they prefer. And they're both part of the current civil disobedience movement that is opposing the military coup and military government right now. So in deference to them, and just to make things simple, I will try to use the word Burma. I may switch back and forth, and please feel free to use whichever term you want. They're both fine. But with that as an introduction, let me just show you a couple maps of Burma. And they'll be coming up in the slides. So this is one map that gives you a sort of a sense of where it's nestled within mainland Southeast Asia, within a few of the countries that are part of the 10-member group called ASEAN, or the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. And then the next slide, the next map, gives you a picture of the different provinces of Burma and the ethnic minorities that are whose territories those provinces are. And that is a huge concern. That is a dominant feature of Burma's geography and politics, which I think may become a little bit clearer as we go, but there's a lot more one could say about that. Okay, so thank you. And then could I have the next slide? Second, when I accepted the invitation to speak today on the subject Myanmar and ASEAN, my immediate thought was that the interest of many in this audience was likely to stem from concern over events in Burma, not only in the past year and a half since the February 2021 coup, but also in the past, at least as far back as the brutal crackdown on the Saffron revolution of 2007. And more recently, the genocidal campaign the military conducted against the ethnic Muslim Rohingya minority that escalated in 2016 and 17. Shared outrage at these events is part of a long history of world outrage at the Burmese military's extraordinary repression and often unrestrained infliction of horrific violence on ordinary citizens, generally unarmed ordinary citizens. So for some of you, concern over military repression in Burma might date back to 2007. For some, it might date back all the way to 1988, when the bizarre policies of the dictator General Ne Win triggered mass protests that became the 4/8 revolution, that also prompted a shockingly violent crackdown, killing thousands, and led to Ne Win's push aside, I wouldn't say ouster, because nobody knows quite what he was doing after he stopped being the leader, but it led to him going into the shadows through a coup by, as it turned out, an equally repressive military junta, again, whom I'll talk about in a moment. All four of these brutal campaigns that killed, imprisoned, and tortured Burmese citizens on a mass scale seized global attention. All four were involved horrific atrocities that prompted alarm and outrage, particularly from Western democracies. All four generated tremendous pressure on national leaders, including our government, and international regional organizations, including the European Union and the UN, but most immediately for this talk, ASEAN, that is the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, again, whose 10-member countries now include Burma, which they refer to as Myanmar. All four of these campaigns raise the same dilemma for those on the outside, like us, seeking, at minimum, ways to stop further violence. So my assumption when invited to give this talk was that our shared interest in ASEAN stems not simply from concern over the often horrifying stories we've been hearing about Burma's military repression, but also at a shared interest in the questions. One, what has been done by international actors wanting to stop the atrocities we hear of, and what, in fact, can be done today given the difficulties such actors face in influencing Burma's generals and influencing the situation on the ground there. To address these questions, I start with a simple statement that we've been here before. That is, we've witnessed the sudden unleashing of unrestrained violence by the Burmese military against unarmed dictators, each time producing spine-chilling atrocities that rally the world to act, primarily by condemning the violence and imposing economic sanctions to ideally induce the generals to cease attacks and, even more ideally, grant citizens freedom from fear and a chance at democratic governance. Next slide. Each time in the past, international action ultimately failed and military dictatorship survived. Go back a slide, please. As US leaders in Congress right now and the Biden administration work to intensify pressure through further sanctions following the 2021 coup, and as the world looks primarily, initially, but maybe primarily to ASEAN to apply its own forms of pressure, we must ask, why should we have any hope of success in reining in the generals to put Burma back on a path to democracy? So in short, what, if anything, is new or different that might provide hope for a better outcome? And therefore, when we ask this, we will be looking at the end at some of the factors that we see that actually suggest a new reality today that may bring us to a different outcome in the future. Viewing Burma and ASEAN from within this frame highlights two phenomena. First, the institutional strength of Burma's military and military juntas as a particular type of dictatorship that's intractable and defies normal forms of resistance and normal overthrows of leaders that we see in more personalistic regimes. But second, it also shows that this third uprising we're seeing right now, this once in a generation eruption of mass protests in Burma, reveals an unremitting yearning for democracy among its citizens. Let's see. Can you go forward another slide? Okay, yeah, go back, please. Okay, thank you. Yep. So I just showed a picture of Ne Win, General Ne Win, and I can't see my slides because the font is too tiny. But let me continue, and then we'll come to a photo of the 4/8 revolution that I can recognize. Okay, so if our focus is ASEAN and the possibilities and limits of international action, we can begin by asking, what has been done in the past to attempt to stop the Burmese military's violence and repression, and what can be done this time? So I come at the problem of what has been done and what can be done from long study of what I term democratic revolutions, that is, revolutions whose end goal is democracy. My primary research on Indonesia's successful Reformasi revolution of 1998, which I mentioned, which I actually spoke on several years ago for a previous Great Decisions talk, it brings me to this study and was based on research of Indonesia's revolution protest student movement back in 1997, 98, 99, and a little bit into 2000. In a course I teach on democratic revolutions, until about 2015, Burma was my negative case. And that is, Burma offers two cases of pro-democracy movements that failed despite using all of the tactics, particularly nonviolence and civil disobedience, used by other movements that we study in this class, other movements that achieved victory, including the 1986 anti-Marcos uprising in the Philippines, the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia, which was part of a series of autumn revolutions, and then the Reformasi Revolution in Indonesia. So now, please switch the slide. And that's Ne Win again, but switch one more forward. Okay, so the first case was the 4/8 revolution of 1988. The first case that I teach in my class is a failure of a democratic uprising against an authoritarian regime. So this was a student-led mass uprising that tried to oust a military dictatorship led by the bizarre Ne Win, whose photo we just showed, who'd ruled the country since overthrowing democracy in 1962 and imposed an economic system he called the Burmese way to socialism that plunged the country into poverty. So in response to this uprising, a military junta, you can move to the next slide, calling itself the State Law and Order Restoration Council, or no kidding, SLORC, took power and cracked down ruthlessly, killing around 3,000, possibly more. The bloodshed and accompanying horror stories that came out sparked international outrage. There's a story of students trapped in a van who suffocated to death. Many other stories came out as well, but that's just one that stands in my mind. So they sparked international outrage, and ASEAN does enter the picture here. It was formed in 1967 and yet was not meeting regularly. I think it was only meeting every 5 years, but it had not yet made Burma a member. So ASEAN enters the picture and draws some criticism for adopting a stance called constructive engagement in response. And then with wider international pressure, the junta actually was forced to hold elections in 1990, the next slide, whose fairness was actually enforced or ensured by foreign observers. So somehow the international community convinced them to hold elections. And I think what they assumed was that they would win. Because one thing that people have noted in the past anyway is that the Burmese military, the soldiers and the officers have maintained for a long time a very confident sense of themselves as good as the saviors of the country, the only thing holding Burma together. So it's not surprising to me that they would have that confidence. But to their great surprise, Aung San Suu Kyi, who is the daughter of the national hero Aung San, and she was also raised in England, she returned to Myanmar after SLORC's takeover and ran for election with her party, the NLD, or National League for Democracy. And the surprise was that she and the NLD won this election in 1990 by a landslide. So the junta was surprised, but then decided to ignore this election outcome and began arresting or killing people, and it ended up killing hundreds in the opposition, declared martial law, and placed Aung San Suu Kyi under house arrest. Had the results been honored, Aung San Suu Kyi would have become president. Next photo. Instead, from 1992 on, the military dictatorship calling itself the SLORC continued to rule, led by the notorious General Than Shwe. And just a note, in Burmese, you do pronounce the TH with a soft sound rather than a hard T. So this was General Than Shwe. And a side note here, another one is that the SLORC eventually changed their name to the State Peace and Development Council, or SPDC, perhaps realizing the unfortunate sound of the former acronym. Following the post-election crackdown, repression increased, reaching phenomenal levels of human rights abuse, including torture, rape, and summary execution, and arbitrary imprisonment for thousands of political prisoners who were actually mostly from the NLD, but they grew to include anybody who posed any kind of threat. The military inflicted its most brutal atrocities, however, against ethnic minorities as part of pacification campaigns in outlying provinces. And so these stories don't get out very much, and to this day they don't get out very much, but these pacification campaigns have included atrocities, mass atrocities, including razing villages. Systematic rape. Rape is a very popular and often used tool of pacification and terror by the military in general, and then the press ganging of people, including children, into slave labor. The junta imposed draconian control throughout the entire country, as far as they could, over communication, following the 1990s crackdown that made it very difficult to organize any opposition. And this was a problem exacerbated by the country's near complete isolation from the outside world. So this is a really dominant feature of Burmese politics, is this isolation. And it became North Korea has been called a hermit kingdom. One could also call Burma for these decades a hermit kingdom as well. And observers actually have described an omnipresent fear generated by the unrestrained use of force to maintain control. During this period in the 1990s, the state also became known for possibly the most extreme form of censorship on its people of any country in the world, except perhaps North Korea, with harsh punishments for infractions and little concern for due process. Nevertheless, by the mid-2000s, students, activists, and thousands of monks were now organizing opposition to the regime that culminated in the Saffron Revolution of 2007. So next slide. Here's the timeline, and so you can look through that timeline. I note here that ASEAN's Treaty of Amity and Cooperation committed the body to principles of non-interference back in 1976, and it was already following this as an informal policy, but it becomes enshrined as a guiding formal policy and principle. And then, so you have the next event is the 4/8 revolution, crackdown, and the junta's takeover. And what I'm showing is a history of violence and the international response to that violence over the years. Then 1990, you see international pressure leading to the election and the outcome leading the junta to annul the election. And then in 1991, I mentioned that ASEAN adopts the principle of constructive engagement. In 1997, ASEAN accepted Burma with no preconditions. So this is where we are with ASEAN when we arrive at the Saffron Revolution. And so move to the next slide. So after ASEAN again enters the picture here, and they go into this situation with, again, this policy of non-interference, but advancing a little bit towards what they called constructive engagement. And this is non-interference in the internal affairs of member states. The mass protests by tens of thousands of monks in 2007, which is where the revolution got its name, the Saffron Revolution, by these monks and then ordinary citizens. These protests were sparked by the junta's surprise decision in August 2007 to suddenly remove all fuel subsidies. So the price of fuel just skyrocketed. And these scenes of oceans of the country's highly revered monks and also nuns who wore pink, these scenes of the monks and nuns in the streets inspired hope in Burma and around the world that the junta would finally step aside and allow democratization. You may recall some of these photos. If you look at the CNN coverage of these demonstrations at the time, you see a lot of almost breathless excitement and anticipation that these protests are going to lead to a people power revolution that will bring democracy. Instead, if we move to the next slide, on September 26th, on September 26th, without warning, the junta suddenly launched a brutal crackdown on protesters, including monks, leading to leaks of photos such as these you see on the screen. And so the sandal one became iconic, and then the other picture is a picture of a monk face down in a stream. The military went in and started raiding monasteries and rounding up monks and explaining that these weren't actual monks, they were terrorists pretending to be monks. And then the other event that happened that was widely condemned by international actors and anybody who was in favor of the uprising was these photos you see of a Japanese journalist who was shot at point blank range. And actually, there's a video of this shooting. So these are two still photos, and left to die on the street. And the outcome of this was Japan actually did nothing in response. So these are some of the images that start to come out. Move to the next slide. Thank you. And once again, we have hope for change, which people had in 1988, and these hopes are dashed. Once again, the junta faced sharp condemnation by many of the world's leaders. The US actually, who had been imposing sanctions since the 1990s, slapped down further sanctions. And President Bush tried in person to convince China's President Hu Jintao to join. And actually, there was a very strong commitment by Laura Bush as well to try to put pressure on the military, on the country itself, to stop the violence and bring democratization. There was a huge outcry from a wide range of leaders and celebrities who made YouTube video pleas for people to join the pressure. And so if you go search this, you can find many YouTube videos. Not quite yet. But China, then and now, not only has economic interests in continuing business with the regime, but is also very concerned about stability on its border. So China did not join the sanctions, and then we'll talk a little bit more about the other countries who also did not join, and the oil companies who were continued to do business. ASEAN enters the picture again in November 2007, a couple months after this, or really during the crackdown, drawing widespread criticism for refusing at first to condemn this bloody crackdown. And just to note here, ASEAN's ambition at the time was to integrate more fully into the international economic market, seeking a higher profile and greater legitimacy. Setting a new precedent, to their credit, the body issued a strongly worded, even confrontational statement for, given the non-confrontational nature of normal relations among these countries and their leaders. They issued this strongly worded statement expressing collective revulsion, and that's a quote, revulsion at the crackdown. And Singapore's Minister Mentor actually called Burma a time bomb at that moment. And so he was very concerned about continuing to allow Burma to be part of the ASEAN without being able to curb them from this kind of crackdown. Now we can move to the next picture. In May 2008, the massive Cyclone Nargis swept across Burma, the lower part of the country, killing some 100,000 people and destroying the country's rice crop. In the face of the worst national disaster in Burma's recorded history, the junta blocked foreign aid, fearing that the cyclone would give foreigners an opening to begin liberating the country from their control. And this actually happened somewhat in Indonesia with the tsunami that hit the province of Aceh, which had been under military control. And then, there was an opening there. So the junta was blocking aid, but I should actually note here that after our ship, as you see in the photo, was turned away, our ship containing aid and supplies, China reportedly did intervene and pressure the junta to start allowing aid to come in. So this is something I actually only learned recently from one of my Burmese students, actually. The junta's blockage of foreign aid, however, and apparent indifference to the mass starvation and spread of disease that ensued prompted calls to charge Burma with crimes against humanity in the International Court, the International Criminal Court. The cyclone here in America redoubled U.S. commitment to ongoing economic sanctions against the regime. But again, companies like Chevron and Burma's neighbors, China and also Thailand and India and Japan, ignored pressure to join the sanctions, making imposition of these sanctions by everybody else essentially ineffective. And the junta continued to enrich themselves from essentially three commodities: heroin, which of course is illicit, oil, and gems. And much of the gem trade is also unregulated. So they remained more or less unaffected by Western sanctions and were able to continue operating. So at this point, the military junta had withstood the challenge of massive nonviolent demonstrations that most recently led by thousands of Buddhist monks and nuns walking right out front in marches. They had withstood economic sanctions and diplomatic pressure, and they withstood celebrity campaigns such as the U.S. campaign for Burma, 30 Days for a Million Voices project. All avenues of protest and pressure that they tried appeared to have failed. Finally, the junta even withstood the rebellion of nature. They kept international aid at bay, as I said, showing that they were willing to let possibly millions die, first from the disaster and then by starvation, just to stay in power. New slide. But then
suddenly surprising much of the world, on March 30th, 2011, General Than Shwe signed a decree that officially dissolved the State Peace and Development Accord with the election of former General and Prime Minister Thein Sein. And so the question many people were asking at that time was, what worked? And so I've got some factors on the screen. And I just want to note that not one of these is actually support for democratization. I think the largest factor was what you might call economic nationalism. If you go through the factors, it passed a new constitution in 2008 that was heavily rigged in favor of the military maintaining control. And then they strengthened their legitimacy through kind of sham elections in 2010 that the NLD boycotted. And so that led them to try to feel like they had to try again for another round of elections. There's no clear evidence that the sanctions that many countries have been imposing worked, but President Obama at this time began engaging the regime economically and politically. There was also alarm among the generals at their growing dependence on China. So this is interesting because China had for a long time been a barrier to liberalization and had been a barrier to putting pressure on the regime to be less brutal. And suddenly China becomes a factor in opening. And the hope was, as I understand it, that the military would be able to begin to use the West as a possible counterweight to China's power. And then there's a huge factor that's related to economic nationalism, which is their desire to become leaders in Southeast Asian governance. And I'm not going to get into the details of leadership in ASEAN, but there were conversations about leadership going on and whether Burma was actually harming the body. Then there's this question of the impact of the revolts themselves. And I have to say here that it's tricky to gauge the precise impact of the revolts, but one factor was that, although the military was very effective in crushing the Saffron Revolution, I don't want to understate that, and blocking its success as a pro-democracy uprising, which leaves it in the category of failed democratic revolution, the revolution still had an impact. And one thing it did was it cemented Burma's status as a pariah state with little to no legitimacy in the eyes of most of its citizens and much of the world. We have parallels, of course, with what's happening in Ukraine right now. And I know most people in the audience are actually thinking much more about Ukraine than Myanmar. Myanmar has kind of been pushed to the side despite an ongoing horrific violence there. But the transformation of Burma into a pariah state had been happening for a long time. But there was this, I think, a growing sense of shame. That's the word I saw one journalist use, one insider, among the generals who, every time they traveled, they would literally be shamed by the people who saw them, who met them. And they also apparently felt shame at the backwardness of the economy, the tremendous poverty such a country so rich in resources actually had. So those are some factors in it. And then in 2015, the NLD went on to win a majority of seats. I think we can have a new slide here. Yes, and so the military actually continued elections, to continue to allow them, and this further supported impressions that the country was moving successfully toward actual stable democracy. And so just some facts: they won 7% of open seats, 25% of all seats in the parliament were still appointed by the military. And the new president, Win Myint, was the second president now elected who held the office with no ties to the military, going back all the way to the 1962 coup. And Aung San Suu Kyi was barred in the constitution from being called president, but she took the name state counselor and became the de facto leader. So these were all seemingly quite positive developments that many people celebrated. But then we moved to map. Next slide, please. Then the world reacted in horror again at reports that the military, and now also civilians, particularly a group of Buddhist nationalist monks, extremist nationalist monks, were committing new atrocities in a massive systematic genocidal campaign to kill and or drive the ethnic and religious minority Rohingya Muslims out of the country into neighboring Bangladesh. There was a massacre in 2012 that didn't get that much international attention, but then the campaign escalated in 2016 and 17. And just before we move to photos here, well, first I want to say Rohingya is the way that people who are Rohingya pronounce their name. The vast majority of people in the media and even academic circles say Rohingya. So, it doesn't really matter which you say. I'm just say Rohingya because I've been told that's the correct pronunciation. But next thing I would like to do before I move on is to warn you that here are some of these photos that Tim was mentioning at the beginning that can be very, very disturbing. So, Tim was going to go through them fairly quickly as I speak. And I'll try to remember to tell him when to end. Actually, Tim, go ahead and just start going through the photos. This is the point at which the most horrific violence imaginable poured out once the world began learning what was happening. So this was a campaign, again, you see this spike in Rohingya persecution and violence against them in 2012 in response to an incident that happened that became a pretext for the violence. But again, it escalated in 2016 and 17. So yeah, I'll say next. So here are images, satellite images showing destroyed Rohingya villages. This was evidence for the international community that this kind of razing of villages, burning of villages was taking place. And next. Now, and this is a photo that two Reuters journalists took that became evidence that there was a massacre taking place, or many, and this was fairly hard evidence. And so they ended up winning a Pulitzer Prize. So this is photo one, and then this is the before photo, and the next one's the after photo. And this became very controversial in Burma, and Aung San Suu Kyi, remember, is in power now. But the military, the powers that be, threw the two journalists in jail. And I've got a story of that comes next for this coverage. They later win a Pulitzer, but here are the two journalists, and this shows them being arrested. So let me continue a little bit more and explain the larger picture. The population of Rohingya citizens in Myanmar went from somewhere between 1 and 1.4 million people in 2015 to between 1 and 1.4 million to 600,000 by 2019. And today, most of those remaining, at least at last report that I saw, remain confined to camps. They've definitely denied citizenship and access to healthcare, education, and employment, although apparently there's been this campaign to vaccinate more of them than really most of the rest of the country, which is puzzling. But anyway, that's something I just read. So continue through the photos. And I'm not going to let you dwell on this, just move past it because that headline was so terrifying. You can, look it up if you like. Here's another picture. These are fairly gruesome pictures. And then what's the next picture? I'll end with this one for the moment and just say, these are children trying to draw the events that happened to them. And these are children in Bangladesh, this massive refugee camp. News coverage of the military's atrocities, such as the photos we've just showed, and the coverage of the Rohingya civilians as they're fleeing across the Bangladesh border, as you may remember, was sustained and widespread, prompting strong reactions from people and governments all over the globe, and triggering a return to many of the sanctions of the past. And let's move on to a text slide here, actually. Triggered a return to many of the sanctions of the past, and also in the US, the passage of new, I think the Biden administration, actually, no, this was under Trump, actually. there were decrees signed, and members of Congress were very vocal in advocating for new laws designed specifically to censure Burma's leaders and use sanctions to demand an end to the ethnic cleansing, which is what it was called for a while until the International Criminal Court actually declared it genocide. But they were demanding an end to this violence and safe passage for those expelled to return. So repatriation becomes a demand. And here's where we come to a very disturbing point in the story, which is that Aung San Suu Kyi, by contrast, reacted by rejecting the stories of military and civilian violence against the Rohingya as fake. And there's a story that I never forget of Bill Richardson, who you may remember as a former congressman and governor of New Mexico, and later ambassador to the UN, who had been a friend of Aung San Suu Kyi's for a long time. And so he went to Burma to lobby her in person to release those Reuters journalists from jail that whose picture I just showed. And apparently, I heard him say this over the radio, when he told Aung San Suu Kyi about the military campaign and resulting atrocities, she actually became angry with him. And again, she called it fake news, and he left abruptly. He was pretty shaken by that. And again, he started to tell the story. Bishop Desmond Tutu of South Africa reportedly wrote to Aung San Suu Kyi. He wrote her an open letter imploring her to intervene to stop the genocide. And he said, "My dear sister, if the political price of your ascension to the highest office in Myanmar is your silence, the price is surely too steep. We pray for you to speak out for justice, human rights, and the unity of your people. We pray for you to intervene." And in February 2020, the Gambia, filed suit against Burma for committing genocide, and they filed suit on behalf of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. So move to the next slide. Far from intervening, as Desmond Tutu had requested, Aung San Suu Kyi went to The Hague and defended the Burmese military, and there's a photo of her. Then we move to the next slide. The International Criminal Court, as I mentioned, ruled based on that case that Myanmar was, in fact, guilty of genocide. And genocide is a tricky label. You know, it requires certain types of evidence and ascertainment of intent, and it's tricky. But they declared in favor of the Gambia in declaring this to be genocidal treatment of the Rohingya. And then this also, Aung San Suu Kyi at this point herself is provoking international outrage, and people are calling for the revocation of her Nobel Peace Prize, which apparently isn't something you can do. But the other organizations began revoking every prize and honor they'd ever given her, and people started, just disowning prizes that they shared with her, that they got, that she also got. It was quite a lot of disowning of her, and so this was going on. And then just to note here, what was ASEAN's response? Well, ASEAN's response was disappointing. They created a statement or issued a statement that urged expeditious commencement of the voluntary return of displaced persons to Myanmar and collaboration with ASEAN's Coordinating Center for Humanitarian Assistance. Indonesia, by the way, was one of the primary parties trying to move the body forward in issuing these statements and providing humanitarian assistance to the refugees and helping them return. And so the focus was on repatriation, but there was weak enforcement. I mean, that there were countries who were just in ASEAN who were turning the refugees away at their borders and sending them right back to where they'd come from. Just to note here, I mean, there are a lot of, I have entire bullet points on why did this country, newly democratizing country, turn to genocide? And one part of this question is, why did people, the Bamar majority in particular, why did they seem to support it, or if not participate in it? Why did the majority of them actually then just not speak out? There are many reasons, and one factor that people note is that when the military ceased to be the common enemy, the country was ready for a new common enemy, and the military presented the Rohingya as such. And the military was engaging in really widespread Facebook hate speech campaigns and disinformation campaigns. And I'll show a photo of one of those in a moment. But it seemed for Aung San Suu Kyi, if we return to her for a moment, that in her defense of the military, it seemed that she used up much, if not all, of the moral authority that she accrued over her decades of resistance that had made her previously a Nelson Mandela figure, an international icon of democracy. So just keep that in mind, because one of the questions at the end, a Q&A at the end of the backgrounder in the Great Decisions book, is the question of, can Aung San Suu Kyi continue to serve as a leader and help the country through this moment with the coup? And that is a question. But one thing that has happened is she has lost a great deal of legitimacy through her stance on that. So then let's see, ASEAN's response, let's move. Oh, the next thing that happens is the coup of 2021. So if you move to the next slide, another election seemed very promising if you weren't focused on the devastating news of what was happening to the Rohingya. And that was the November 2020 election, in which NLD wins 82% of the open seats. And this apparently became too much for the military. There was talk leading up to this of changing the constitution so that it was less rigged in the military's favor and stripping them of a lot of the benefits that helped make them wealthy. I'll just leave it at that. But they lost patience with democratization, and then on February 1st, 2021, as you know, they staged a coup, arrested Aung San Suu Kyi and other NLD leaders. This prompted an immediate eruption of mass protests and the civil disobedience movement. Okay, so next slide, please. So here's just some photos of this. There's millions of photos out there of this movement, some much more spectacular than the ones I'm showing, but there's just one statement right away: we don't accept the military coup. And they move to the next slide, and I said that the protesters, the people across the whole country, began engaging in a civil disobedience movement, much like the one Gandhi led in his non-cooperation movement in India. And you see their teachers are striking, and then you go to the next slide, nurses are striking, civil servants of, throughout the country were striking and bringing the country to a halt. Yeah, you can go to the next slide, it's fine. Okay, so the next thing that you might predict is that there was international outrage, even though people had sort of mixed feelings about Aung San Suu Kyi in many corners. There was international outrage because this was an illegal coup, obviously, and it was an undermining of a democratization project that much of the world, at least Western world, had supported. So countries began imposing sanctions, including the U.S., and then, but this is where Biden comes in. He immediately passed decrees that directed sanctions at the generals, specific generals and members of their family. And these sanctions have gradually been increased. ASEAN's response was problematic and continues to be. But on March 27th, one thing that happened was Thailand, Vietnam, and Laos sent representatives to a military parade in the capital city of Naypyidaw on the day of this massacre of about 100 people that included women and children. And so those two coincided in the same day, and that was that stood out to people who became very disillusioned with ASEAN. And then in April, following that, ASEAN began to be proactive, and they crafted a 5-point agenda. And the backgrounder for this talk actually lists the 5 points of the 5-point agenda, but it's mostly, saying we want to prepare the way for the return to democracy, and lists different concrete ways in which the military needed to do that. But the problem that ASEAN's facing right now, and has faced for quite a while actually, is that a split has developed, as indicated by the sending by Thailand, Vietnam, and Laos of representatives to this military parade. And some people have argued that what we're seeing now that's affecting ASEAN and much of the world is, what's happening in Burma kind of epitomizes a a struggle between authoritarianism and democracy. And this is a struggle we're also seeing in reactions to events in Ukraine. So this became kind of a flashpoint for people in ASEAN, to member states in ASEAN, to have to confront each other. The majority of ASEAN states at this point are, if not completely authoritarian, then moving towards sliding in the direction of being not free. And actually, the most free country in the region is East Timor, who's not even in ASEAN. But Indonesia is still, I think, would be held up as the most democratic country, still kind of trying to hold its own and trying to influence Burma. And one thing that Indonesia offers is a model of how the military can return to the barracks. And I do think that when ASEAN talked about constructive engagement and logic of bringing Burma into the bloc, even though their economy was moribund almost, and they had become a pariah state, there was this idea that Burma would learn by example, and Indonesia, I believed, felt that it could lead by example. So just to add that there. But other things to note are that ASEAN had aspirations at this time for aspirations for supporting the rule of law and human rights. And they actually have included language within their charter that is directed right at the idea of supporting democracy and human rights, or at least human rights. But they have this non-interference policy, which some people feel has greatly weakened their ability to come together and impose any sanctions. And nobody's ever had to pay any price to get into ASEAN, and they don't seem to have mechanisms, possibly beginning with this non-interference policy, for enforcing any of the, sort of the positions they take, trying to express opprobrium towards countries like Burma, particularly Burma. And Burma actually has been cited as an albatross, and this goes back over a decade now, an albatross around ASEAN's neck, because it really brings to the fore this tension within ASEAN between authoritarianism and democracy, between countries that want to continue to exercise their own repression and violations of human rights without being called out by other countries. So that's a split that I should probably mention here before we move on. So this is something that people have been saying and noting in commentary on what's happening. There's a realpolitik that people who are in the resistance, who are part of what the National Unity Government, which is the shadow government that members of the NLD have formed and other people now have joined, trying to understand how to pressure other countries to pressure Burma, or pressure countries, even just to get countries like the United States to pressure other countries like China, who actually do have some influence, to put pressure on the military to undo some of what they've done, or at least stop the violence. So it's become very layered. And the place I noticed this most was I attended a Burmese American community conference on the Spring Revolution, which is what this is called. And the members there were, high up members in the government were trying to talk about possible things they could do. And they went through all the international actors, and they said, well, we can't expect much from the UN because they keep letting us down. The United States only acts on its national security interests or economic interests, so we have to always appeal to that in the United States. And I don't know if that's entirely true. I think there's a lot of outrage among lawmakers here. But going through these countries, and then the European Union actually just slapped I think, broad-based arms embargo on Myanmar/Burma. So there have been various things that the people who are in this shadow government and in this civil disobedience movement have been looking at to try to troubleshoot themselves. The conclusion they came to, though, at the end is that they can't depend on international actors. They must depend on ultimately civil society, which I think is very interesting. I'm running out of time, so let me just go through the rest of my slides quickly. Next. This is just an example, and I'll just hold that for a second, of the military-led hate speech campaign against the Rohingya. And then to next. The one thing that is very interesting, if we go to this slide at the end on what's changed, is that, you go back one, that the Bamar majority, when particularly the younger generation, once the coup happened, they actually got access to information on what really happened in the Rakhine state and what happened to the Rohingya, and they began a national apology campaign, national expression of, multi-ethnic Bamar majority, and then many of the ethnic minorities expressing regret for the campaign and apologizing the genocidal campaign. Okay, so the next one is something the military has just done, is released this monk Wirathu, who is the top leader of this hyper-nationalist group of monks I mentioned, who helped incite via Facebook and other media, and some of them joined the genocidal violence against Rohingya. So that's kind of a bad development. Next. And this is a slide my student created that explains some of the things that Gen Z is doing, and they've become very creative with social media in ways I could explain later. And then next. Okay, so as I come to the end here, I promised at the beginning, I said, so we've been here before. We've been in a situation where the world is looking at Burma, and as we're now looking at Ukraine, and trying to figure out how we can influence events and stop horrific violence that continues and continues. And just to give you an example of how bad things are, my students both have lost people that they know in the violence by the military. Some 1,500 people have died, possibly more. But it's, and one of my students just had to find a way to pay $2,000 to get a family member out of jail. So the violence is horrific. But what has changed? What's different? This mass civil disobedience movement was widespread, it continues to be, and determined. They actually did all but shut down the machinery of the state. There's the shadow government I mentioned, that's new, that didn't happen last time. Energy companies, and this is huge, have been pulling out for the first time after initially objecting to being asked to join the sanctions last year. Burma is more integrated into the world economy, and they are suffering a severe economic contraction. I could give you lots of stats on that, but they've contracted by, they're about 30% down from what they would have been without the coup, by estimates by the World Bank and others. And they may be facing a liquidity crisis, which may make it impossible for them to continue buying arms to kill people with. But Russia has been helping them on that. And then there's Generation Z. And so Gen Z is a huge force, and I have a lot of hope for them. I don't know how many people you know in Gen Z, but they are different. And I could go on about that. But the new multi-ethnic solidarity, I think, is also very important to keep in mind. And then there's been, I put up here defections at greater than 2,500, which indicate the potential for a split in the military. This is new. In 2007 and 1988, only one soldier in each case, so an officer, defected or broke ranks. And now we've got the conference I just attended a couple of weeks ago said they're up to 6,000 defections. So somewhere between 2,500 and 6,000 defections, which is phenomenal. The military suffered a lot of casualties too. So next slide, please. That's my conclusion. So to conclude, yeah, we've been here before, but recent events in Burma reveal a couple of things. First, the particular repressive capacity of a closed elite, whether an economic oligarchy such as Russia or a military junta such as Myanmar's. These closed elites by themselves are formidable, perhaps limitless in their ability to continue repression. And so this is what we're going to see in Ukraine as well. And internet, they tend to be intractable and more resistant to the weaknesses that divisions create that I just mentioned, such as those in the Philippine military, the divisions that led to the fall of Marcos, and in the Indonesian military, which prompted the change that led to a fairly bloodless student uprising against Suharto in 1998. These, in both cases, divisions in the military became a door to democratization. Military juntas are much more difficult in that sense. And then second, what it reveals is a mass yearning that we see for democracy, and that it may be deeper and wider than one might expect. So we may see a continued pattern of repression punctured only intermittently by democratic uprisings that seem at this point to be once in a generation. At this time, there are things that are different, and I'd love to hear what people out there think about those things. And I would also like to know, and I didn't put this on a slide, that so these are two things that I think that this case can tell us about the situation we're facing in the world right now. Two ends of it: growing authoritarianism and the intractable nature of these oligarchic states. I think particularly so with a military junta, who has mechanisms, institutionalized mechanisms for changes in power. And then also the rise of new generation, which is there's this milk tea alliance across all of Asia, and students are definitely connected through that. But the last thing I want to mention is this Burmese American International Conference asked me to ask you guys specifically to, I mentioned that I was going to be giving this talk a couple of weeks ago, and they said, please tell the people you're giving the talk to, who include people from the League of Women Voters, who I'm a member, to support Burma Act, the Burma Act, which is currently moving through Congress and the Senate. And I can give you information on that, but they want people to write to their representatives and support this particular act, which is moving through our legislature right now. So I think I'll leave it there. I hope that I've left a little time for questions, hopefully ones that I can answer. But thank you so much for having me.
You definitely have time to answer questions. We have a couple that have come in already, and I'm going to add myself back into the picture just for a point of reference, but keeping it small. Would you care to talk? We do have some questions coming in, but would you care to talk a bit about the Burma Act?
About the Burma Act. I read it, and it's you can read it. I can send you the link right now. If I probably could send it to you right now. I'll send it to you, and you can send it out to people. Is that okay?
Okay,
because I don't want
sure, that's great.
Screw up the video here. But it's sanctions. It's not really that hard hitting. Economic sanctions continue to be one of our only weapons, our only tools, I should say, for putting pressure on these regimes. And we see this as a huge limitation in dealing with Ukraine right now as well. Sanctions targeting, individuals, and so there is a desire for greater influence by the UN, but they continually fail, and this has been cited as a growing weakness in the UN, their inability to intervene themselves. And this is one reason people are looking to ASEAN, actually, the most toothless of the international bodies, regional bodies out there. But they have one thing they've done. Oh, I should have put this in the slide. Well, what else has ASEAN done? The NUG has been begging them not to recognize the military junta as the legitimate government of Burma. And I don't think they've actually done this, taken that next step, as somebody in the conference said. But they also haven't recognized the NUG, which includes all these officially elected people like Aung San Suu Kyi and people in the NLD. They haven't officially recognized the NUG as representatives. But what's been happening with ASEAN is they've been they've had a special envoy they've been sending, and they've had 4 of these already. I think we've got a 4th one from Cambodia now. The Brunei one got very frustrated because he'd go to visit the country and try to engage in dialogue with the NUG and the military wouldn't let them see Aung San Suu Kyi or anybody from the NLD or anybody. And so there's this frustration within ASEAN right now. And right now, the Cambodian person who's the newest envoy to deal with this situation is in, I believe, Yangon, trying to pave the way for something over the next 3 days. So to go back to the question, the Burma Act, I think, could help. It certainly wouldn't hurt. And I do appreciate the bipartisan solidarity among our legislators and in our government on this issue. We can agree on this, just as most people are agreeing on Ukraine, we can agree on this. So I always have faith in international pressure, partly because we saw that over time, even after 2007, 2008, the generals felt that international pressure. And nobody, I think, can survive long without legitimacy among its own people. And in Burma, that has to include legitimacy among the military, because they are the primary constituents for support for the regime. They're kind of a state within a state, but it's also very difficult to survive without legitimacy internationally when you want to join the world market and the body of ASEAN itself really would like to not have this albatross around their necks. So I believe writing to your legislators and saying, please support the Burma Act, I think it would help. They do listen. This is one thing I learned when I was working for lobbyists in DC way back in the 90s. The members of Congress, when they get letters in particular, that one letter can have tremendous weight in influencing the legislators' gauge of what their voters are thinking, what their constituency is thinking. So what's in it, again, is primarily sanctions and diplomatic force, but again, worth reading and worth supporting.
Well, if you could send me the link, and anyone who's following along, if they would like the link, please contact me at the library. My email address, just for the future, let me put that up there quickly, is tkaczynski@manitowoc.org. I'm not exactly sure why it's scrolling, but if you would like that link about the Burma Act, please get in touch with me at tkaczynski@manitowoc.org.
Or you can actually Google it. It will pop right up if you Google it.
Which is even faster.
Yeah.
So yeah, definitely Google the Burma Act if this is something that you're interested in pursuing.
Especially the League of Women Voters, you know.
Oh, awesome.
So.
Well, we do have a couple of questions. I, of course, have questions, but I will defer to others right now. There's an array of questions. I will just start at the top and move through. John was wondering, and I'm not sure if this is in reference to the extreme nationalist monks or during the Saffron Revolution, and are the monks Buddhist?
Yes.
And what is their function in society, and do they still beg for their food?
So yes, and their function in society is they are very central. Buddhism is the national religion, and the military has worked very hard to divide people, to use Buddhist nationalism in particular to help divide the country. I could get into a whole long thing about the military's history of dividing and ruling as their way of staying in power, following the British model before they were ousted after colonialism. But these monks, so this is interesting. The monks do still beg for food. And one thing they did during the Saffron Revolution was they turned their bowls over. And that was a huge statement and got a lot of attention. So the one thing that brought shame to the military was this widespread condemnation of attacks on the monks. And people knew that it wasn't, they weren't just all terrorists. So that was very powerful. But let me just say here that I didn't explain what happened with the Rohingya genocide. And part of what happened was the disinformation campaigns, the propaganda campaigns through Facebook. Facebook has now taken a very different position, by the way, led people to fear the extermination, literally, I think that was the word used, of Buddhism. And the fear was that the Rohingya were becoming a gateway for the influx of ISIS, the influx of Islam, radical Islam, and conquering Islam into the country, and that Buddhism as a way of life, as a religion, Buddhist people who are Buddhists were in danger of being eliminated. I mean, it was really existential and created this tremendous fear. And the nationalist Buddhist monks whipped this up in themselves. This is a group, I'm trying to remember their name right now, but it's not everybody, but there is this very, very defined group of nationalist Buddhist monks led by the guy Warathu whose picture I just showed. And Warathu continues to spread this kind of disinformation and hate speech to this day. So that's a complicated question, but no, I think their function in society remains what it has been for decades, and the nationalist Buddhism is something that's fairly new and has been exploited by the military.
Thank you for your question, John. On to the next question, and please keep submitting questions as we go. Jean wanted to know: are you aware of the Karen people?
Karen,
excuse me, pardon my pronunciation. The Karen people who resettled in Milwaukee, who were forced to leave Myanmar. She wasn't quite sure when.
I'm vaguely aware of the Karen in Wisconsin. I didn't know that it was specifically Milwaukee. Well, actually, that's not true. I just did this workshop for K-12 teachers, and it was on genocide, because I don't know if you guys know that there's a law that just passed in Wisconsin called Act 30, which is a law that requires that K-12 teachers teach on the Holocaust and other genocides at least once in grades 5 to 8 and once in grades 9 to 12. And so that's a change. And that was actually triggered by, or the impetus for that came from new studies that came out showing a really low level of knowledge among the millennials and Gen Z on the Holocaust itself. So I advertised this workshop to school districts across the state and got a huge response from Milwaukee. And the reason I was given is that there is a Burmese population there. And I have no doubt it would include the Karen. The Kachin, the Karen, the Shan, the Kayin, I think, the Chin even, boy. You know, you really can't name an ethnic minority in Burma that hasn't suffered tremendous repression, that it's on the scale of what the Rohingya suffered, or to the degree they suffered, but not quite as wide a scale, forcing the kinds of mass expulsions that got world attention. So I have no doubt that the members of the Karen minority felt forced to flee. That doesn't surprise me.
Thank you for your question, Jean. Barb has a question. Does the general population have access to social media in Burma or the internet, or is it restricted by the military rules such as we see in Russia?
This is a great question. Okay, so I used to do talks on Facebook and Facebook's responsibility for the Rohingya genocide. And I was very angry at Facebook. I tend to be angry at Facebook. I don't know about the rest of you, but they had, okay, so what Facebook did was it came to these impoverished countries that had very little telecom development, and offered something called free basics. So they got in at the ground floor in Burma, let's say as an example. And this is a country where people had not had access to the internet for years, forever, never. And suddenly everybody who bought a phone could get onto the internet for free through Facebook, get free data. So then what happened was, this was actually worked well for the military and the Buddhist nationalists, because they were able to spread disinformation through Facebook. And one thing that's distinctive is that for those people who go into the internet through free basics, Facebook is the internet to them. You know, they don't go to Google, they don't go to other sites, they go to Facebook, and then they go out into the world and communicate with people via Facebook. So they were kind of susceptible to the spread of almost what you could say a disease throughout the country, as poison that was kept being injected by the military and by these monks or these nationalists. And so it is interesting to me that in the crackdown, suddenly Facebook became a vehicle for people finding out what had really happened. So that was interesting, but then the military started to shut down people's Facebook accounts, they shut Facebook out. And then apparently the country then moved to Twitter, and then they shut that out. They somehow cracked down on that. But then at many points, they've just tried to cut off the internet entirely, but they can't, because it doesn't work. They're too integrated, and people are too dependent on the internet and actually on social media. So now there's intermittent repression. But what's really interesting is the way people have come up with to get around these the military's attempts to block them off of these outside sources, and they're bad at it. People started using VPNs, virtual private networks, and that's been a factor. But what my Burmese master's student told me is that people walk around with two phones. And so they have one phone that when the military, soldier comes up to them and confiscates their phone, they look at it, and that phone has nothing on it that's interesting. And so then they give it back, or they take it, or whatever. But then you carry around a second phone. I don't know how people afford it, but you carry around a second phone. So they found all these ways to kind of get around the restrictions of the military, the attempt to isolate people again. But you can't put the toothpaste back in the tube in Burma. And I think they have much more access than actually people in Russia do right now. And they're using social media in very creative ways to fund the resistance. So let me just tell you about this one last thing. So my student told me about they don't have ways to get money to the resistance over there directly because there's, the military is taking control of the banks and so forth. So one thing they're doing is they have links you can go to every day. And I would have showed that in that slide I had up earlier, where you click on the link and you go to Facebook, and Facebook says, click on this. And every time the millions of people out there who know about this click on certain links, they get the person who created the link, to a cat video, to a game, whatever. The person who put the video up gets revenue. It's, because it's monetized. And so then they take that revenue I don't even know how much it is, because this is potentially millions of clicks and I don't know how much each click is worth, but this is a steady stream of funding going through social media now in these clever ways that people have found to get around them. And so my student said it's her daily duty to go to this link and click on 10 videos and just watch them for a second or so. So
Wow.
I love that story. I love Gen Z. I love Gen Z. My daughter and my son are Gen Z. So.
Thank you for that very good question, Barb. You had mentioned earlier, I believe I heard you correctly, that gems were one of the major exports
Yes.
from Burma.
Jade, rubies, and sapphire to some extent, but primarily jade and rubies. And those are industries controlled by the military.
That's what I was, because everyone's heard the catchphrase "blood diamonds." You've heard that, but you don't really hear about it coming out of Burma. But is it the same sort of situation where it's forced labor and?
Well, yeah. The military
beyond
have used ethnic minorities for forced labor a lot. I don't know what the situation is right now with those industries, but the military control over certain sectors is being challenged by sanctions, and the U.S. just banned retailers here from trading in these gems. The retailers are mostly ignoring this ban, but that's one thing our government has done, is banned people from purchasing gems from Burma. So that could become a thing. You create a taboo and people say, I'm not going to buy rubies anymore. I don't know where it came from. I'm just not going to buy it. I didn't buy a diamond for my wedding. I used my grandmother's ring. So, so boycotts of those gems might make a difference.
John had another question. What nations give support to the military in terms of equipment, etc.?
Russia. Russia is known to be the most blatant, unapologetic supplier of, I think they supplied them with some MiG planes. Does that sound right?
MiGs, yeah.
Yeah, and armored tanks. But Russia's needing to get supplies from elsewhere now, so they might be no longer able to do that. But Russia has an economic interest in in Burma as a market. So Russia has been cozying up to the junta and and then China the military is playing China off of India. So I don't know if China's selling arms to Burma, but they just were accused of selling arms to Ukraine, and they've denied that. But, it wouldn't surprise me if they're buying these arms from various places. And I'm not entirely sure what all of the countries are, but Russia's definitely one of them I just was reading about.
Please keep your questions coming in, because we have an incredible resource here. So not to sound horribly mercenary, but, take advantage of the knowledge that we have at our disposal. I was wondering, I heard that the U.S. was going to come out today and condemn the coup that happened for genocide. Did that happen today? And do you think what effect do you think it will have? Because you hear about these things, and you hear about that The Hague is looking into war crimes and genocide again. But as you brought up earlier, that has happened previously. to seemingly no real lasting effect at any rate, if any effect whatsoever. What do you think anything, if the condemnation did come today, what type of effect it will have moving forward?
Well, I don't think it would have that much effect because the Biden administration has already come out very strongly against the coup and has been imposing these sanctions. It could be meant to coincide with the Cambodian ASEAN representative, the envoy I just mentioned, visiting Yangon. This could be a larger international moment. And I don't know even what happened today with the Cambodian envoy, whose name I don't have at the tip of my tongue. But the Burma Act is, as I said, it's moving through the legislature. The Biden administration has already taken a position. So I'm not sure how much more emphatic the Western democracies, particularly the U.S., could be, and what difference that might make. But I'd be interested to, like you, read up on this and see what the logic was and whether it made a difference or it could make a difference. I wanted to note something else. If people have more questions, please go ahead.
Go ahead first, and then I'll bring another question in.
Okay, so this is something I meant to mention. There are many sort of things to throw in about what's different. I came up with a list about 20 things that are different. And I mentioned defections. But defections are actually something to take quite seriously, because there's the research done by people who have observed previous democratic uprisings. There's a guy named Jose Almonte, for example, who served in the rebel movement within the Reform the Armed Forces movement, it was called, in the Philippines. And they were actually bad guys. They were not good guys. They were torturers. But they became a force for splitting the regime splitting the country against Marcos and taking control and then handing control to Cory Aquino, who became the president in 1986 with Marcos's fall. So what he argues, though, is that the key factor to look for in a military is whether soldiers are willing to shoot on civilians. And what you often find is that there's this revulsion against shooting on civilians. And the Burmese military have been brutalized, especially those who've been in the outer provinces. And again, I mean, the rape is just, matter of course, tool of repression and terror. So when Aung San Suu Kyi was giving speeches back in the early 90s, and before they put her under house arrest, there were soldiers who were nearby who were listening, who were starting to sort of be sympathetic to what she said. And they got swapped out with soldiers from the provinces who've been engaging in these pacification campaigns. And the reason was that these soldiers were the ones who would be willing to shoot on unarmed civilians. So Burma's already moved past the phase where soldiers will be repulsed at shooting on civilians, except that they're not, except that they maybe haven't moved past it because it may just be a human condition. You have to see fellow citizens as non-human. And I think the experience of shooting on unarmed people in the Bamar majority has really traumatized much of the military. And it's very different, I think, for them when they've been led to, harbor this hatred and dehumanization of ethnic minorities. So all these defections, I think, are a function of soldiers, of a split. And it may be a split that's, gone external. The people who can't shoot on civilians are leaving or have left, and the people who can are fine. But there's an economic crisis that's hitting the soldiers as well. And I believe that the regime is very vulnerable to a split right now. You can never see them coming, but it's important to watch for cracks. And if we see a crack in the military that, reflects the larger trend of defections by soldiers who just say, I just can't shoot on children, I just can't shoot on unarmed people, then I think we might see an opportunist come up and try to seize power, try to overthrow Min Aung Hlaing, who's the current top general. I think it could happen. So I'm always saying, watch for the split. I think military juntas are incredibly difficult to break because they have, regular channels of promotion and circulation of leaders like the Communist Party in China. But I see potential for a split. So watch this space. I don't know. We'll see what happens. But that's one more element of this equation I really wanted to highlight.
Definitely. I have two questions that kind of feed into each other. I will take the first one from Anne. Can you comment on Aung San Suu Kyi's current legal situation?
Oh, well, yeah. So she's been charged with corruption. That's a favorite one. Oh, gosh, I had a list of the charges against her. I wrote them down. They're very typical, but then there are some that are bizarre, like, using a cell phone or something. Just kind of, she's been charged with a raft of violations. And again, I thought I had it written down, but some of them are funny and some of them are just, what you would expect. And then there's NLD members have been charged with fraud because the military, their pretext for the coup was that there were problematic voter lists, and this was a fraudulent election. So she's facing decades in prison just from, the individual charges alone. Each one of them carries a certain amount of time, but then when you add them all up, she's facing a legal situation where she could be thrown in jail for years, or she could be held under house arrest indefinitely. Her legal situation there is that I don't think she's in legal jeopardy internationally, because it was the military generals in the country who were the military was being brought to court in the International Criminal Court by the Gambia. But yeah, her legal status right now is, they're not going to let her go.
The question that leads out of this and into your next response is, what is your opinion of her?
Well, yes. So I do have an opinion of her. And I was very disappointed in 2012 to start hearing about the slaughter of the first massacres of the Rohingya. I didn't want to believe it. I had taught her in my course as a Nelson Mandela figure. I have these quotes from her. I have this picture of her that, she became the embodiment of all the ideals of democracy in one person. David Steinberg calls her that. And he has this lovely quote. I think she's racist. I think she was already exhibiting authoritarian tendencies in the last couple of years. She was throwing critics in jail for criticizing her. She was consolidating power and shutting ethnic minorities out of the process. She was placing people in to represent these ethnic minority provinces who weren't actually members of the ethnic minority. They were Bamar for the most part. So she was already a problem. And her defense, I used to say, she shouldn't have defended the military. She should have gone on a hunger strike. But she was adamant afterwards. She did not want to be a democratic icon. She's a politician. And so I believe she blew it. I believe she has left the country vulnerable to exactly what's happened. And that's a fault in her leadership, in her character, I would say. And I believe that the positive news for me, because I was just, I didn't even have much sympathy for her when she got thrown in jail with the coup. I don't know. I think a lot of the world was sort of, that's what you get. But then this pro-democracy movement, the young people, the civil disobedience movement, all these people just rose up and they were so inspiring. And they had this apology campaign to the Rohingya, condemning what had happened and distancing themselves. Aung San Suu Kyi is definitely still a very popular figure, and people want her out of jail. But one thing that I heard people begin to say is she's just not as relevant anymore. So there's this question: is she necessary to bringing the country back into out of this military dictatorship and back to democracy? Is she necessary as a leader? I'd say no. Maybe she needs to be a figurehead, but I think the good news is that people are learning that they don't need her. I hope. I mean, it's easy to be too optimistic. We've been here before, but that's my opinion of her.
Well, thank you for sharing that. Another question from Barb: have you traveled to Burma, and if so, what were your impressions of the country, the people, etc.?
I've never been there. There was a brief window when I could have gone there, and I had two kids. It was hard to get into. Now it's impossible to get into. But it's supposed to be an incredibly beautiful country. And everybody I know, I mean, I meet a lot of students from Burma all the time through our program, our Southeast Asian Studies program. We get doctoral students and MA students, and they're lovely. And they're, they're from different ethnic groups within the country. And I've seen, their photos. Yangon has undergone a tremendous transformation since opening in 2000. The whole country's undergone a transformation since opening in 2011. So it's probably changed a bit, but it's still, I would love to go there under better circumstances.
We have a few moments left for a question or two. If anyone has any last minute questions, now's the time to get them in. While I'm waiting to see if anything comes in, just wanted to remind everyone that we've had 7 phenomenal lectures this year with great decisions so far. Tonight was absolutely no exception, and I'm so glad that we could make this happen with your travels as they were going on, and the tragic coffee air turbulence situation that occurred. I'll go behind the curtain a little bit and let everyone know that Dr. McCoy had to redo her entire PowerPoint this evening because it had been destroyed by a bit of turbulence and an errant cup of coffee on a flight. But she, a fantastic PowerPoint, fantastic lecture. Want to remind people that the last lecture for 2022 next week is Outer Space with Kenneth Phillips, who is the curator at the California Science Center, and he's the curator for the Aerospace Wing. Should be another phenomenal presentation. It's been amazing to me how on point the topics have been this year for things that were going on. And while that is somewhat the case, this year has been just really amazing. And I don't have anything that has come in. So
could I just ask if anybody has a note on how hopeful they are either for Ukraine or Burma or more generally in this sort of global battle between authoritarian and democracy that people are noting? If anybody has had it after the talk on Ukraine last week or Russia.
Yeah. Anyone out there, please get your comments in, because it isn't all that often that our presenters actually ask you for your input.
Sort of like optimistic, pessimistic.
Yeah, thumbs up, thumbs down. Are you optimistic that the situation will head in the right direction, or otherwise? I know there are people out there, so I know I'm not just talking to the void. We only have a couple minutes, so please give your opinions on optimistic or pessimistic for what the future holds for these two countries, and I guess the world in general. Not to be too broad. Don't be shy. I won't even put them up. I won't put them up on the screen. I will just read them as they come in. If you would prefer to remain anonymous. I'm not sure if people want to remain anonymous, so I'm just going to read it. Someone put in the comment, "It's a long road to justice."
Great quote.
Yeah. And that's absolutely true. I'm not excluding your name for any other reason than I don't know if you want to put out there. But anyone else care to put any other notions forward? We have about probably 4 minutes. I can stall. I can stall with the best of them. So I think this is another opinion. I think it will ultimately be positive, but it is going to be a slog.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yep. Keep them coming since we have just a couple minutes left.
Or what people think about Gen Z, because I'm so optimistic about Gen Z, even though I know that they've got such a difficult future.
I personally am very optimistic. I have a daughter who just recently graduated from USC and has entered the workforce and is, trying to make a difference with what she's doing, and her outlook for me, has been inspirational to me since she was 2 years old.
Oh,
Honestly, and not to give an overly long story, but I'm giving a little bit of a story so that people can chime in online if they want to. But we were out on the East Coast when 9/11 happened, and I was in the city when it happened, and I managed to get home. As all the bridges were closing, as I kept driving north, and I'm like, I will find a bridge to be able to cross back into New Jersey. And I got home, and I was clearly upset, and my daughter uh, uh, came up to me and gave me a hug, and she was like, are people in trouble? And I was like, yes. And she's like, well, then we should help them.
oh.
And I don't mean to get like gooberish about it, but my daughter's been an inspiration to me, and her age group, as with your children, have been an inspiration to me for a long time. So I didn't mean to. I had no intention of throwing that out our presentation tonight, but I think we are out of time, and I think there were just two people that wanted to comment. So not to leave it on my story, but Dr. McCoy, fantastic lecture tonight. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
And thank you to everyone who came to the lecture this evening. I love great decisions, and I think it is fantastic that we can offer such a depth of knowledge to people online because of the pandemic. But when we can have it in the library, it's also fantastic. I love it in all its iterations. So again, thank you to everyone. Tune in next week for Outer Space. Completely different topic, very much a shift, but thank you very much for coming. Something came in. This I will put up here. Ann Judy said, thank you so much for this excellent presentation.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's kind. Thank you.
And just flat out applause from Barb.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you so much for coming. Hope to see you next week. Again, thank you so much for being here, Dr. McCoy. It was an absolute pleasure having you. Good night, and we hope to see you next week for this year's conclusion to Great Decisions. Have a great night, everyone.